Hi, everyone. My name is Alice Alston, and I'm going to be talking about the book that I chose to read, which is called The Female Brain. So, I'm going to be sharing some insights from this. This book takes us through a timeline of how a woman's brain develops and changes throughout her life, along with emotional processes that might come along with that. A woman's neurological reality changes so much more than men's, both with age and with menstrual cycle. This book does a really good job at showing the differences between those two brains. So, like I just mentioned before, the book outlines different stages of brain development from birth to old age. So, here on the screen, you can see baby brain, teenage brain, mommy brain, and then mature brain. So, the baby brain, as talked about in the book, even as infants, girls are wired for connection. A baby girl tends to focus more on her mother, while a baby boy may be more drawn to their surroundings. Teenage brain, a time of emotional intensity and heightened sensitivity to social cues. The mommy brain, which I will talk a lot more into later on. This phase is dominated by caregiving instincts, strong emotional bonding, and increased multitasking abilities. Finally, the mature brain, which is when and around when menopause hits. As children grow up, a mother's brain shifts. She may feel less inclined to clean up after them, and hormonal changes often lead to a decreased sex drive. So, this here is a graph that is shown during the teenage brain section of the book. And I thought it was pretty important just to include because this will be the first time since infant puberty that a female brain will marinate in high levels of estrogen. In fact, it is the first time that the brain will experience estrogen progesterone surges that come in repeated monthly waves from her ovaries. These surges will vary from day to day and week to week, and this is kind of what is happening during when a girl first gets her period. And I thought that was really interesting about how much these levels of hormone shift. This book does a really good job at highlighting key differences in how men and women will react to different situations. It provides examples of couples navigating marital or dating issues, breaking down how their brains interpret conversations differently. Another part of that is mommy brain versus daddy brain. It's a concept that is talked about in the book, how parenting changes the male brain differently from the female brain. While mothers often take on a nurturing role, fathers' brain adapt in ways that emphasize protection and problem solving. On the slide here, you can see the direct differences that a male and female might experience during that same time period. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about communicating and emotional processing. So, a lot of research when comparing male and female brains show that women process emotions more extensively than men. Studies from both the University of Michigan and Stanford show that women will use both sides of the brain to process emotional experiences, while men will typically use one. Along with that, when viewing emotional images, 9 areas of the brain lit up in women compared to only 2 areas lighting up in men. Women also tend to remember emotional events more vividly, recalling specific details like conversation, meals, and even weather, whereas men are more likely to forget such nuances. This is linked to a woman's larger hippocampus and a more responsive amygdala, which enhances emotional memory and sensitivity to social cues. So, still in the same communication section of this is a quote that I found really interesting, and this whole story was extremely interesting to learn about. So, this is an example of Sarah and her husband Nick, where Sarah basically gets a feeling that her husband is cheating on her, and the book basically walks through what's happening at this moment. So Sarah is able to read her husband and notice his little things and differences that make her question his loyalty to her. But it's how she came to this conclusion that's like the most interesting part because Sarah's brain actually is searching for inconsistencies between her husband's words, tones, and body language, an ability linked to the female brain's heightened emotional intelligence. Nick, her husband, is extremely puzzled by Sarah's emotional reaction, illustrating a common disconnect between men and women in communication. However, once her brain processes enough conflicting information, that emotional dam breaks and shows how prolonged suppression can lead to intense emotional release. So, still in the same communication section of this is a quote. As similar in the last quote that I talked about, a lot of women will feel like a gut or, a reaction in their stomach that's telling them that something's wrong. And that's kind of because they're able to, mimic what they're seeing and, learn things from that, even if they don't understand what they're doing. I really like how this author continues to go back to the Stone Age women's heads to show maybe why an evolutionary trait might have happened. So, this is a quote that kind of talks about that and shows how that talent might be there to help women for anticipating the physical needs of nonverbal infants or also giving them like a heads up or warning about potential dangers and consequences around them to help protect themselves and their children. So, as I just gave an example of a real life couple that the author mentions, I'm going to go into one more and talk about how it connects to relationships. One of the most fascinating parts of this book is how it decodes relationships, and I love that it gives both sides kind of to what the male brain and the female brain might be thinking. So, this example comes at the end of the book and talks about the female brain during or after menopause, where maybe both people in this relationship are unaware of the changes that are happening to the female brain and the body. So in this example, Sylvia is getting more and more irritated by her husband and by almost everything he does. She used to be someone who would avoid fights at all costs and would always have empathy for her husband, as her Stone Age brain was compelling her to. But after menopause lifts those filters and they come off, she's a whole change in perspective. It's so interesting that such a drastic change could happen, and it's actually talked about in the book about how now her anger pathways are becoming more like a man's. A few pages later, in relation to the same story, her whole family is wondering what's happening to their mom and saying, "Where did she go? And we want her back." And everyone's very confused at what's happening. This connects back to the beginning of the book about how women's neurological reality changes much more than a men's with age and menstrual cycle. It's talked about earlier in the book about how a woman's is more like weather, forever kind of changing, and a man's is more sturdy and more built up and doesn't really change as much over time. When thinking about how some of these things connect back to class, I think back to the conversation about how when women find themselves in a setting dominated by men, their brains instinctively activate a fight or flight response, a survival mechanism shaped by evolution. In this book, it actually has a section where it talks about why or how this might happen. So men often have responses geared towards direct confrontation or escape. Women have developed additional stress responses, as talked about earlier, that prioritize protection and caregiving. Research suggests that female mammals under stress rarely abandon their offspring once a maternal bond is formed, leading to a more adaptive reaction, one that balances self preservation when ensuring the safety of their children or dependents. This evolutionary trait explains why, in high pressure environments, women may exhibit heightened vigilance, increased cooperation, or a lend and befriend response rather than simply choosing to fight and flee. I just found that super interesting because we were talking about how it might be hard for, a woman to say something in that type of setting. And it does go back neurologically to maybe an evolutionary trait. And that's just really interesting to me.